Gangs with knives, the occasional firearm, judges too soft, sentences too lenient, innocent bystanders maimed, injured and murdered. I'm not talking about the gang culture of the early 21st century. I'm talking about the reality of Manchester in the late 19th century. And with me now to tell us about his book, The Gangs of Manchester, author and social historian Andrew Davies. Welcome to Channel M today.
Thanks.
It's a fascinating book. Nothing's changed, really, has it?
No, I was astonished when I was doing the research for the book just how familiar the headlines were, and even some of the detail in the stories, right down to a sense of young people in gangs wearing uniforms with patterned scarves and a certain kind of cap tilted in a certain angle to denote that they were gang members. And all the time as I was reading the historical cases, I kept getting images in my mind of young people stood around on street corners today. It was so familiar, it was shocking, really.
Right down to the colours, the patches and stuff. That's the gang colours of New York and Los Angeles and places like that, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So there were a lot of territorial gangs in Manchester and Salford in the late 19th century. They would colonise a particular district around one of the thoroughfares in the residential areas near the city centre, and they would dress a certain way, they would stand in a certain place or frequent a certain pub, and woe betide anybody who they accused of trespassing on their territory.
Well, the book is The Gangs of Manchester, and it's described as the story of the Scuttlers, Britain's first youth cult. Now, my dad was in the Navy, so I know what scuttling is. Scuttling is putting a hole in a boat so it sinks. So why were the gangs scuttling gangs, Andrew?
We don't know exactly why that name was chosen. What we do know is that it was used in Manchester as early as the 1860s to describe boys from a particular street who would gather together to wage war on the boys of another street. So the earliest use that we have of it is from around 1868. But what we also know is that this was a peculiar term to Manchester and Salford. There were gangs in other big cities in England at the same time, but they had different names. So the term scuttler was only ever used in Manchester and Salford.
So if you hear somebody talking about a scuttling gang, they're talking about a Manchester gang. And for these lads, fighting was almost a leisure activity, wasn't it?
It was. I
mean, there was turf wars and stuff, but it was, you know, drink-fueled violence was what you did because there wasn't very much else to do, or is that unfair?
No, I think that's right. They were fighting for the sheer excitement, for the thrill of it. But the other thing that they were very concerned about was reputation. This was a way in which young people could prove that they and the street that they came from was tougher than, and as they then saw it, better than any other street in the city. And one of the things that I found interesting was that sometimes the newspapers would single out a scuttler and say he was a really terrible criminal. There was one young man from Salford labelled the king of the scuttlers by the press, and he had that legend, as it were, sewn into a jersey that he then wore around the streets of Deansgate and Salford like a legend in his own lunchtime, literally.
What sort of violence were they engaging in? Are we talking knife crime, violence? We're not talking about guns here, are we, in the 1800s?
No, we're not. There's only literally a handful of cases in which it's reported that guns are used. Generally, young people are fighting with knives and also with the buckle ends of their belts. Oh. And that could be a very, very dangerous weapon. There were a lot of skull fractures treated at the Salford Royal Hospital and the Manchester Royal Infirmary, and also a lot of quite severe stabbings. But the other thing that's very noticeable is that there's very few deaths. So the young people are fighting to maim and scar and injure each other, but they're not seeking to kill.
You've had it turned into a play, or somebody's so taken with it, it's been turned into a play, hasn't it?
That's right. It's Mad Theatre Company, which is a fantastic community theatre group based in Moston, but recruiting actors of all ages from all over North Manchester and Salford. The play's called Angels with Manky Faces, a homage to Jimmy Cagney. It's like Jimmy Cagney in clogs, really. And this opens at the Library Theatre on Monday. And
you're at Borders, aren't you, in the Manchester Fort tonight, doing an illustrated talk based on your book, I understand.
That's right, and also, as part of that event, we're having the first scene of the play performed by actors from Mad Theatre Company, so they're clearing the shelves as we speak to create space for the drama.
We're running out of time. I want to ask you one more thing, and brief if you can. Is there anything we can learn from the scuttlers of then that would help us deal with the gangs of now?
There's a very simple message. For about 20 years, people tried to deal with scuttlers by jailing them. It didn't work. It was when the Lads Club movement was formed in Manchester and Salford.
The famous Salford Lads Club and others, yeah.
And equivalent organisations in places like Ancoats, that really made a difference. I think if you invest in young people, then you'll get much better results than relying on punishment alone.
It's a fascinating book, Andrew. Thanks for coming in and telling us about it. The Gangs of Manchester, the story of the scuttlers, Britain's first youth cult.